Hey folks, Utgarde Keep is one of the first dungeons you'll encounter in Wrath of the Lich King Classic, and even though the trash and boss encounters in this dungeon are relatively simple by modern standards, there are still many important mechanics that you need to know about. Since this guide covers both difficulties, I'll be sure to mention whenever an ability is unique to the heroic version of the dungeon. Finally, while the footage shown here is from retail World of Warcraft, all of the strategies in this guide are written with Wrath Classic in mind. With that being said, let's get into Utgarde Keep. Right at the start of the dungeon, you'll encounter two Dragon Flayer Iron Helms. Their only notable ability is an interrupt on their current target, so as long as you aren't slowly casting spells as a tank, you should barely even notice this. Next, you'll encounter two types of mobs, Dragon Flayer Metalworkers and Dragon Flayer Weaponsmiths. I'd recommend only pulling one side of this hallway at a time, since these enemies can be quite dangerous if you pull too many of them at once. The Metalworkers will periodically cast Sunder Armor on the tank, and their attacks will deal bonus fire damage that also bypasses your armor. The Weaponsmiths will periodically stun or disarm the tank, and they'll also cleave onto nearby melee DPS, so these should be faced away from the group. Once you've cleared out the first hallway, you'll enter a large forge. The path forward is blocked by three large walls of fire, and in order to disable them, you'll need to attack the Dragon Flayer Forge Masters, which are the mobs pulling on a big chain. The Forge Masters will cast Burning Brand on the tank, which is a fairly nasty fire spell that also causes you to take increased fire damage from all sources. In total, there are 3 different Forge Masters within this room, but you'll only need to defeat 2 of them in order to move on. After leaving the forge, you'll enter a room full of enslaved Proto-Drakes and Proto-Drake Handlers. In my opinion, the most efficient way to get through this room is to pull the Dragon and Handler on the left, and then walk past all of the remaining mobs until you reach the final pack. Since this group is blocking the exit, you'll be forced to fight it. As for the trash mechanics, the Proto-Drakes will cast a Frontal Breath attack at the tank, and they'll also periodically knock back all nearby players. For obvious reasons, tanks should face these mobs away from the group. The Proto-Drake Handlers will mostly spam cast Throw on the tank, but they'll also cast a buff called Unholy Rage on nearby allies. This buff increases the attack speed of affected targets by 70%, and it counts as an enrage effect, so it can also be removed by Tranquilizing Shot and similar abilities. That being said, Unholy Rage will also deal a light amount of damage to the affected target, so assuming your tank can survive the increased attack speed, you might want to let the buff stay up. Within this final hallway before the first boss, you'll encounter a pack of 3 mobs, 2 of which we haven't discussed yet. The Dragon Flayer Strategist has 3 abilities. Hurl Dagger will target a random player and deal a hefty amount of physical damage to them. Ticking Time Bomb will cause a bomb to appear on the ground, which explodes after a few seconds, dealing a large amount of fire damage to anyone standing nearby. Finally, Blind will disorient the strategist's current target for 3 seconds. Dragon Flayer Runecasters are easily the most dangerous enemies in the entire dungeon, and they should be the top kill priority whenever you find them in a pack of mobs. Their first ability is Njord's Rune of Protection, which places a massive absorption shield on another mob. This shield may as well be an immunity because it's nearly impossible to DPS through it before the buff actually expires. The Runecaster's other spell is Bullthorn's Rune of Flame, which is a buff that pulses fire damage onto nearby players. Thankfully, both of these buffs count as magic effects, meaning they can be removed with abilities such as Spellsteal or Purge. Upon entering the following room, you'll notice the first boss of the dungeon, Prince Keleseth, along with 4 other Vrykul trash mobs. While these mobs are all linked together, they're not linked to Keleseth, so you can kill them off before actually starting the first boss fight. Prince Keleseth has only 3 abilities. For most of the fight, he'll spam cast Shadow Bolt on the tank. Shortly after the fight begins, he'll summon 4 Vrykul skeletons which spawn in the doorway to the right side of the room. After a few seconds, they'll begin running towards the group, so the tank will need to be fast about gaining aggro on all 4 of them. When a Vrykul skeleton is killed, it'll only stay dead for 20 seconds, after which point it'll revive and continue fighting. Keleseth's final ability is Frost Tomb, which targets a random player and encases them in a block of ice, stunning them for 20 seconds. While stunned, players will take heavy frost damage over time, so the group should kill the Frost Tomb as soon as possible in order to break the stunned player out. It's worth noting that immunities such as Divine Shield or Ice Block will allow you to immediately break out of the Frost Tomb. Also, in case you're wondering, it is absolutely possible for the tank or healer to be targeted by this ability, which is probably going to be the main cause for your wipes in this boss. That being said, as long as you kill off the skeletons as quickly as possible and then swap to Frost Tomb immediately, Prince Keleseth shouldn't be a very difficult encounter. Once the first boss has been dealt with, you can head down the tunnel to your right where you'll encounter Dragon Flayer Overseers, tunneling ghouls, and a few patrols of frenzied geists. As long as you don't overpull here, this trash should be fairly straightforward. After heading up a large staircase, you'll enter a room with 2 packs of mobs. The left pack is completely skippable provided you hug the right wall. The next pack can't be skipped and will contain 2 runecasters, which can be fairly annoying to deal with since you usually can't interrupt both of them. You'll also encounter a new mob, Savage Warg, in this area, but it doesn't do anything special outside of attacking the tank. After heading up the stairs, you'll have to clear out 1 more pack of runecasters and strategists, as well as a handful of tunneling ghouls and frenzied geists. Once they've all been dispatched, you'll encounter the second boss encounter, Skarvald the Constructor and Dalronn the Controller. In order to complete this fight, you'll need to finish off both Dalronn and Skarvald, but after one of them dies, they'll return as an unkillable ghost and continue casting their abilities until the other boss is dead. For this reason, I highly recommend killing them both at the same time, as there's no advantage to focusing down one of these bosses. Skarvald the Constructor has 2 important abilities. Charge will cause Skarvald to run at a random ranged player, dealing damage to them and stunning them for 2 seconds. This is fairly annoying, especially if it targets your healer, but it can be completely negated as long as everyone in your group stands within melee range of Skarvald. On heroic mode, he'll also cast Enrage on himself, which buffs his attack speed and damage done. If possible, use abilities like Trank Shot to remove this buff immediately. Dalronn the Controller cannot be tanked, and he'll instead spend most of the fight casting Shadow Bolts at random players. This cast is interruptible, so you should stop as many of them as you can in order to help out your healer. On heroic mode, he casts 1 additional spell called Summon Skeletons, which causes 2 skeleton adds to appear. Ideally, this cast should always be interrupted, but if it goes off, the tank should grab the skeletons as quickly as possible. Finally, Dalronn will cast Debilitate on random players, which is a damage over time effect that also reduces casting and attack speed by 50% for 8 seconds. After Skarvald and Dalronn have been laid to rest, you can move up the staircase and into the next room of the dungeon. There's only a single pack of mobs in this room, but if you once again hug the right wall, you can skip them and continue up the following staircase. The next 2 packs you'll encounter will contain a mix of 3 new enemies. Dragonflayer Bonecrushers will cast Knockdown Spin, which stuns nearby players for 2 seconds and deals a fair amount of damage to anyone hit. Dragonflayer Heartsplitters will mostly spam cast Throw on the tank, but they'll also periodically cast Piercing Jab, which deals moderate damage and lowers the tank's armor by 30% for 20 seconds. Finally, the Dragonflayer Spiritualists will spam cast Lightning Bolt in the tank and cast Flame Shock periodically. Although the Lightning Bolt is interruptible, you'll want to save your CCs for her 3rd ability, Healing Wave, which she'll cast on nearby mobs whenever they're low on health. Once you've reached the walkway overlooking Howling Fjord, you'll encounter a Proto-Drake Rider which is mounted on top of an enslaved Proto-Drake. These drakes are identical to the ones that we saw earlier, so tanks should once again face them away from the group and be mindful of the knockback. Despite having a different name, the Proto-Drake Rider has the exact same abilities as the Dragonflayer Heartsplitter that we just discussed. He'll primarily cast Throw on the tank, but he'll also periodically reduce the tank's armor by 30%. Now that you've cleared out all of the trash, you're ready to face the final boss of the dungeon, Ingvar the Plunderer. At the start of the fight, your tank should grab Ingvar and position him alongside one of the nearby pillars. You should also ensure that he's facing outwards towards the railing because of his first ability, Smash. This is a frontal cone which deals heavy damage to anyone hit, so as long as he's facing to the outside and the tank moves away before it goes off, you should be able to completely avoid the damage. Ingvar will also cast Cleave, dealing physical damage to the tank and a nearby melee DPS. Ingvar's most important ability is Staggering Roar, which deals moderate damage to all players and interrupts any spellcasting. However, if you line of sight the boss using one of the pillars in the room, you can avoid taking damage from every single Staggering Roar. Tanks might want to avoid doing this though, as it'll mess with the boss positioning, but the healers and all 3 DPS should be LOSing every single Staggering Roar. After you kill Ingvar for the first time, the fight won't actually end. Killing him will instead trigger a 25-second long RP event which causes Ingvar to be resurrected. Immediately after being resurrected, Ingvar will cast his Roar, so your group should already be hiding behind a pillar in order to avoid the damage. During this phase, Smash is upgraded to Dark Smash, and Staggering Roar becomes Dreadful Roar. The key change to Dark Smash is that it now also hits the entire group with unavoidable damage and stuns everyone for 2 seconds. Unlike the Roars, this effect is impossible to LOS. The only change to Dreadful Roar is that it now causes you to take additional shadow damage after you're hit, but assuming you're correctly LOSing it, this doesn't really change much. In addition to these changes, Ingvar will also gain 2 new abilities, the first of which is Shadow Axe. This causes a spinning axe to appear below a random player, and it'll deal ticking damage to anyone standing nearby. If this appears on top of you, make sure to move as soon as possible so your healer doesn't hate you. Finally, Woe Strike is a curse applied to the tank, and while it's active, anyone attempting to heal them will take a light amount of damage. If possible, you can remove this with a decurse, but it's also entirely possible to just heal through the damage. Thankfully, after killing Ingvar for a second time, he'll stay dead for good, and you can go and collect your loot. And with that, we've covered everything you need to know in order to clear normal or heroic Utgarde Keep in Wrath of the Lich King Classic. If you want to learn more about the other dungeons present in Wrath Classic, I'd recommend checking out my Dungeon Guide playlist, which you can find linked in the description below.